So hello and welcome guys for a video for Hedge Knight Wargaming. Today we're fully operational in the garden studio now, which is where I do most of my hobby. Today we're going to go through one of the hobbies which is quite close to my heart and has been the catalyst for me to get into many different systems which I all enjoy. The system is Middle-earth SBG, or Lord of the Rings, which is what it was officially called as back when I first started playing nearly 20 years ago now. The current edition has many different kind of flavours to take away from it, but it's all been kind of progressional from the original skirmish game, which is kind of warrior versus warrior, hero kind of leading troops. There's lots of depth to the game, and it is one of those games that I'd love to say is very easy to learn but very difficult to master. I've been very fortunate in playing this game over the years. At the moment I play on an international level for the UK. I've been quite fortunate in winning tournaments and things like that, and I'm quite happy to teach others to get into the game just to promote the system as a whole. I've taught many people over the years, all from kind of beginners level to getting them first into the game, and it doesn't take long for this to stick and for people to take it on board and love it just as much as I do. Like I said before, it's got so much depth, there's so many different scenarios to play. You could even go down the route of playing more kind of themed matches, and they all kind of come from the source books that you can pick up. Generally, to get started in this game, it's easiest to pick up the Pelennor Field's introduction box. Games Workshop did some fantastic introduction boxes back in the day. I think my favourite was the Two Towers box set, which is what I bought to get myself into this game after starting with some of the Fellowship models before that. It kind of gives you, in a nutshell, everything that you need, essentially starting with the rulebook, which is one of these. These will cost you about £20 to pick up, sometimes a bit more if you were to go straight to Games Workshop for them. It kind of gives you all of the flavours about how things kind of operate throughout the system, special rules, magical powers, all those sorts of things, and some scenarios to play with. However, some of the scenarios have been kind of developed over the years through playtesting and tournament scenes. And then it's been expanded on further with other source books and other upgrades, which currently at the moment, if you were to play at tournament level, would be the match play guide, which was released last year, which has typically, I think it's 20 odd, 18 individual scenarios, which will tell you basically how to play this, and at the same points level, obviously. Victory points and all the rest of it is kind of differential between each scenario. You also have elements of building tournaments, and tournaments are the biggest thing for me. Again, that's why I started this channel, was because I love to go around tournaments around the country to meet new friends, obviously see existing friends, have a good night out, and generally kind of let your hair down and play toy soldiers, which who wouldn't at the end of the day. So that's one component of why I enjoy the hobby. What you need to do once you've got this rules book is kind of have an idea of what sort of faction you'd like to play. Now, with Middle-earth SBG, it's very much different from other games you'd play. I would always tend to try and push somebody towards something that they thematically would like to enjoy. So when I first started, it was a case of the Two Towers was the biggest kind of film out at that time, so everybody wanted to play like Haldier's House and Rohan and all the rest of it, which, if that's something you enjoy, by all means start investing in those sorts of models and start learning as you go along, and the best way to learn is to play. I'll go through an introduction today and teach you how to do the basics for this, which hopefully will give you kind of the steam to start doing it yourselves and start finding kind of partners and local tournament scenes to go and be a part of. Once you've had an idea of what faction you'd like to play, you'd then go out and buy kind of your armies of the Lord of the Rings. If it was a Lord of the Rings era army you'd like to go and do, which is typically kind of all of your source book armies in each one. You've also got the armies of the Hobbit, which is more Hobbit era kind of armies, which again are very beneficial if you want to play that. And then more recently they're bringing out these source books, which are much more chunky than the original source books. I remember when I started with Tau and all the rest of it, it was kind of like 60, 70 pages, and most of it was all theme, but nothing really about all kind of the types of what you want to do. This is kind of more scenario based, but it brings different aspects around legendary legions, which is kind of where you get benefits of taking more thematic armies in game, as opposed to kind of chopping and changing what you want to do. But you can always do that in Lord of the Rings. You have an armies ally matrix, where essentially if something was historically accurate, you would give a benefit for your army list throughout the game, which is sometimes very minimal, but it's also very handy when it comes down to it. For instance, say your Uruk-hai, the Uruk-hai were very kind of sturdy. I believe that they wouldn't break until they were at 66%, as opposed to say 50% if your army was fully themed, and other different variants are out there as well. So there's lots of different things to take on board with Lord of the Rings, and sometimes it can be a bit overwhelming when you come into starting a new game, because you think, well, is there a meta, is there this, is there that, and it always puts new people off. But in this system, I can safely say, out of all the years I've played, it's a very kind of rewarding hobby. You don't need to be spectacular at this game to play it at a good level, and also you enjoy it because of its simplicity and the kind of scenarios and the things that you can do in the game, which are always a bit strange, but quite funny, and you can have a beer and have a laugh at it as you go through. Another part of the hobby that I love is that this is very terrain heavy, so it makes almost like a film scene going on in your head as you go through. So you can play out iconic moments from like the films and the books, and it looks lovely on a tabletop. So that is one component I really do enjoy, is that you can rock up to a tournament with, say, a really nice themed army. You might get smashed every game, but then you could be rewarded with the best themed army and the best painted army and whatever. But then at the end of the day, as long as you've had fun, that's the main thing. So hopefully you enjoyed this video, guys, and if there's any other things that people would like to clarify, or any ideas of what you'd like to see, just drop them in the comments below and I'll see what I can do to help you guys out. Okay, all the best. So here we have our introduction board all set up for you guys. Essentially most games happen on a 4x4 tabletop surface. I've slightly made this smaller just to emphasize kind of what we have to our availability with small numbers in forces. So as I said before, this game is very scenery based, so you'd want about 60% scenery in this sort of area, just to make it a bit more thematic, and you can then use scenery to your benefits in game. And again, cool things can kind of occur out of that. So I would advise having a good amount of scenery, or theme to kind of what your scenario would play at. Just for this simple one, we have an army list essentially built up from Uruk-hai, and the Uruk-hai is led by Uglug, who is essentially a captain. He's got 6 troops, Isengard warriors, 3 with pike and 3 with swords and shields. When it comes to making your army list, essentially what you'd want to do is start out by picking a hero to lead your army, and then you division down into kind of your detachments, as it were. So this is quite well done in SBG, because each hero would have a tier. The minor tiers would lead potentially up to 6 troops. You have independent heroes who won't be able to lead any troops. They're like your golems and kind of your special characters and stuff. Minor heroes are kind of people that would potentially be like a lieutenant in, say, an army position, only leading like a handful of people. You then build up to your captains, who are fortitude, and the fortitude, they can lead 12 individual troops. You then build up into kind of more prestigious ranks, kind of into your valor tier, which is essentially 15 troops. And then you have your heroes of legend, who would lead potentially 18 troops. So each one would vary. Usually there's a points increase with each one, and obviously the stats will improve as well quite heavily with each. I just go through each of the army lists as we've gone through here. Basic troops, so you have essentially warriors and heroes in this game. The heroes, again, more costly, and you need them to lead the troops. The warriors then build down into things like your normal static troops, but it could involve elite factions as well. So you might see berserkers in your warriors. You might see, I don't know, crossbowmen, feral Uruk-hai in an Uruk-hai faction. But your bog standard kind of warriors are like your Uruk-hai scouts and the Uruk-hai warriors, as you can see here. They all do something different when it comes down to fighting, but generically they're relatively good with high defense and high stats in that area. Stats wise, as you can see, you look through the source books and you can see individual points and times like that. I won't go into each points faction for them, but as you can see, the main faction here is the stats on them. So fights, strength, defense, attacks, wounds, courage, and then movement value, which is usually 6 for, say, a normal warrior, human based around that. But you also have elements of hobbits potentially would move 4, goblins would move 5, flying monsters, those sorts of things would move 12. And again, that's kind of where you go from there. Over on the good side, this is one area I've just started repainting. These are some Gladrim models. So the Gladrim elves in this particular position, they're a similar points value to the Uruk-hai, as you can imagine. There's one less because the captain there with the bow would cost potentially more points than, say, Ugluk would. So just for a bit more kind of balance in this game, I've made it as balanced as I could. But it should be enough just to kind of get you ideally looking at what we can do with the grand scheme of the game. So each sequence, as you can see, we have 5 individual phases. Usually starts off with the priority phase. This would then be a setup pre-game. Obviously, the one that tends to win gets to choose. And as you go through, it's a kind of you go, I go sort of scenario where it's move first, then the opponent would move, then it's shoot phase, then into fight phase, and then into end phase. There are some variants to this when it comes to hero models. They do have might, will, and fate modifiers, which are a little bit more technical to kind of understand to begin with. So I will do a separate video just to kind of go through the illustrations of when to use might, will, and fate and kind of the heroic actions that would interrupt the normal state of play, which is your turn sequence, okay? And with the Gladrim, we have 2 elf bows. We have 1 Gladrim elf with sword, elven blade and shield, 2 spearmen, and then an elven captain with a bow. So relatively simple. I'm not gone for anything elite or anything like cavalry or anything like that for this kind of scenario, just because it's a case of I'll teach you the basics. So on each side we have your Isengard dice to represent the Isengard player, and we have the Fellowship dice, which are essentially the elves. Okay, so you'd roll for your priority phase. Obviously you'd be person versus person, but COVID restrictions and all that, I'll just kind of play it through a turn or two just so you understand it. So here we have a 5-1, so essentially the Isengard player has priority, so they would be going first in this situation. When you move down the aspect of having priority, it's very important when it comes down to draws and things like that. It's sometimes a tiebreaker if you have priority. You also get to choose which fights to go where, which is huge when it comes down to the combat phase, because again, you might have a model of yours which is trapped, and you may be able to untrap it by choosing to go first with another model, and that also works to your benefit when it comes down to the opposing player having priority, choosing when to do certain things, when to resolve certain heroic actions, and those sorts of things. So priority is a huge component to the game as a whole. What we then have is the move phase. So the Uruk-hai player would go first. We're not, again, doing any heroic actions or anything like that. And you'd go based on their movement stat, which is 6 from the book. You have your movement templates, which again they sell through Games Workshop. They're completely unnecessary, but they look pretty cool, as you can see. Lost the tree. But just a generic tape measure will do the same trick. So Uruk-hai don't have any shooting weapons in this scenario, so their best bet is to come and charge and get stuck in true Uruk-hai fashion. So the movement is very particular in this game. I have to say, it's simple enough, but because every model is completely independent of itself, you have to be very particular in how you move. So in certain areas of effect will affect them. So if they were, say, broken and they had to do a courage test, you'd be using the captain's, say, stand fast, which is usually around 6 inches, to make things stay as a group, as opposed to like independently on their own. They have to test individually, and their courage is not always as good as, say, a hero's would be. So you have to be very particular in how you move these things. And again, it's very precise when it comes down to charging and influencing other kind of game modes as well, and contesting, say, objectives. You need to stay within a certain range, which again is very important when it comes down to it. So that's one thing you need to understand with the basics of that. There is no shooting on the evil side, so you would go past the shoot phase. But obviously we're not in the shoot phase yet, we're still in the move phase. So the movement phase then passes over to the good side. So the good side have some bows, and they need clear line of sight to shoot at what they can see. So as you can see from the line of sight here, you have a bowman here, already in range here. So I wouldn't potentially move that bowman because they're already seeing someone. And the elves on this side have a bit of an obscured shot, so I would potentially move those in a moment. You can still move and shoot, however you would need to move half of your normal distance, and you then apply a modifier on the to hit roll, which is a -1 usually. With the elves normally though, I think, well, the ones without weapons to kind of shoot, they are going to move up and set a bit of a vanguard, just so that they're ready for the oncoming charge of the Uruk-hai. The bowman on this side, so the captain, will move up 3 inches, shortly followed by the other elf there. You would then get down to the model's eye view, and you would check line of sight of what you could see. And in this situation, there is one model out there poking at the front who is unobscured. Now, if you can still see part of the model, you would be able to shoot it, but you then incur a in the way test for certain things. And that again comes down to almost common sense, but there is a table. If it is, say, a building, say like that, and 50% is obscured, you're looking at, say, a 4+ in the way roll just to make sure that you hit, and that's before then rolling to wound. So just for the shoot phase here, the second phase of what's going on, the Isengard player would go first with shooting, however they don't have any, so they would pass. The shooting actions then happen of the opposing player, which will be the elves. So we have 2 models that have moved, this one and this one, and we have one model that has not moved, so this one here. So you can roll these all together if you wish, but sometimes it's better to kind of break them down so people understand what's going on. And also with the captains, they also have might modifiers. For this, we won't be using the might, will, and fate, just for kind of your own understanding. So I'll roll them together. The black one is the one that essentially has not moved. Their shoot value is based on the actual page of their stats. Typically it depends on what they have or what race they are. As you can imagine, elves being so highly disciplined, they hit on 3s. Uruk-hais would hit on 4s. Normal humans would usually hit on 4s. Orcs, goblins would hit on 5s, those sorts of things really. So hitting on 3s and 4s, we have a ridiculous roll already. So essentially all 3 of them is hit. So there's no obscuring terrain from here to this individual here. We're looking to roll 6s to wound him. Again, I rolled them all together, so you would just potentially be killing the one instead of dividing your shots essentially. You need 6s to wound it. The wound chart, as I've said before, is all in your rulebook, but here's a bit of a C from there. It's based on the strength versus the defense, which is all very simple. It's a strength 3 elf bow, as you can see on this chart here, and it's trying to defend wound something that's at defense 6. So we're looking at a 6+. Obviously your dice rolls are 6, and then essentially if it goes to really high defense like ring wraiths and Sauron and God knows what, you're looking at a 6 followed by essentially something like a 6, or a 6 followed by a 5, or whatever it states by the chart. It's simple enough to learn once you've done it a few times. So as you can see there, all of the bows have hit, but they've kind of pinged off their armour and not done any wounds. So the Uruk-hai is laughing at them at the moment. That then moves on to the fight phase. As you can see, there are no models that are in base-to-base contact. So this means that the fight phase is not happening at this moment in time because there is not a combat to kind of initiate it. We then move on to another priority. So this would be round 2. Simple as, and it kind of goes on from there. Moving from priority, this time again, the Uruk-hai can maintain priority. Uruk-hai's best method of kind of getting involved is charging forwards. At this stage, if you were playing a scenario, you might be doing a lot more tactical things like securing objectives, focusing on kind of assassination, burning buildings, all these sorts of things really. But just for a gentle slog together, it is a case of get involved, try and kill the opponent, try and break them, and then it reduces them to kind of courage and breaking points and stuff like that. There are additional victory points for things like having a banner and all the rest of it, which comes into play. So that's the movement phase of the Uruk-hai. We're moving on to basically the else players ones. So this is a benefit of having second turn, as you can see, and therefore you can react to what's going on. So for this situation, I would there be trying to charge involved here. You've got 6 inches of movement, so it'll easily get there. You then base-to-base contact. You can't go into, say, an inch radius of the opponent, as you can see here, because you're trying to charge that one guy here. If you were to, say, go into his control zone, which is a kind of invisible 1 inch around the model, you would have to negate and charge that. Unless you're already wrapping round into that model, you can then go into that area but not go further. Same position with these. So we have the spearmen. Spearmen are slightly different. So they can spear support by going base to base, which means that they do not have to base to base the model. The enemy model, you can go base to base with the good model. Therefore, you don't get hit in combat if he was to try and hit you, but you can go into base to base and potentially trap. So this is what I would potentially do in this position. I feel it's a bit more of a benefit when it comes to, say, the fight phase, which we'll go into in a moment. From the elf point of view, I think they'll give one volley into the actual Uruk-hai and go from there. So movement phase on this is now done. We're now looking at the shoot phase. The shoot phase, again, for the Uruk-hai, they do not have any shooting, so that's null and void. So it goes over to the elf player. The elf player would then nominate targets. So in this situation, they're going to go for broke and they're going to try and shoot into Uglug here. So as you can see from the model eye view, one of them would have a clear line of sight, unobscured by that model in front. However, the other two would have an in-way of this model here. So that in itself, you need to be sensible with. So you choose as and when which one you're going to resolve. I'll just move that out of the way so the other camera can potentially see. So shooting here, all of them have negated their movement, so they don't have the modifier of -1. The black dice doesn't really make a difference because it's the hero, but essentially we're not going to use the might, will, and fight as a modifier. You're hitting on 3s because they're elves, so 2 hit successfully. Oh, the black one would be the in the way. I knew there was a reason. So black is essentially doesn't have the in the way. The other 2 yellow ones did have in the way of this chap here. So the yellow dice needs a 4+ in the way of the model obscuring Uglug, to which he hits this model here. So now the models are separated when it comes to wounding. This model, again, defense 6, strength 3, would need a 6 to wound him, which successfully wounds him. There isn't, say, an armor save in this game, You do have fate saves on heroes, which is essentially a 4+ kind of armor save, which would prevent a wound. You also have other things like magical powers like Fury, which would do the same thing, but at a kind of a lesser level. So you need 6s to kind of stop that. But that's again a bit more advanced than what we go through. So if you manage to wound a model, which as you can see is quite hard at the natural 1 in 6 chance on a normal dice, you've killed it. Okay, and that again is a benefit of heavy armor versus, say, a strong bow like an elf bow. Is one of the best weapons in the game. The next one essentially is a strength 3 bow versus a defense 5 model. So Uglug the hero doesn't have a shield, so he doesn't get that +1 to defense. You need to wound him on a 5+ on the wound chart, and another 6. So Uglug would take a wound here. You would have his fate save, which he has 1 fate for, and it is a 4+ to negate that. However, we're not going to go into that. We're just going to keep him with what he has basic, which is 2 wounds. So he's taken a wound, which is not a good day when you're an Uruk-hai captain, because he's fighting troops who are equal fight value or above him when it comes down to combat phases. So it's still the Uruk-hai's player is priority. They will choose where to go combat-wise. In this situation, we just have the 1 combat. So you have 3 individual elf warriors. One is armed with an elf blade, so they can do certain things like special strikes. And you have 2 involved with spears who can spear support. Obviously the spear supports aren't working because they're in base to base with the model itself. However, the elf blade can decide to get a -1 to its fight roll, to therefore then get a +1 to its wound roll. So it's a risk-benefit ratio in this situation. It can only feint if it's a higher fight value than the opposed model. So him being a fight 5 model as Elsa basic against a fight 4 model, which is an Uruk-hai, they can do this, but they reduce their fight value by D3. So in this situation, you would reduce your D3 if you were to special strike, which I will. He goes down to fight 2 because it's D3, fight 3, sorry. But it doesn't really matter much because you've got 2 models already in there keeping their fight value at fight 5. So in the essence of a draw, the elf models would still win because they have fight 5. Fight 5. So we'll do the rolls here. We have the Uruk-hai who will roll 1 dice. However, they have a shield. A shield means that you can double the amount of dice that you have at a baseline. However, you won't make strikes against the attackers. So it is a case of just hiding and trying to take on as many as you can and try and hopefully live. So he's going to shield here and he gets a double 1. So at this moment in time, it's not looking good for him. The Elven Blade gets a -1. So he goes to a 4, and the 2 from the spears, they get a 6 and a 5. So the 6 would take it over the 1. So it's not a good day to be the Uruk-hai. Now, in this situation, you've trapped the model. The model cannot make a full inch back away from the opponents. So you can't negate damage, essentially. When you're trapped, you roll double the amount of strikes onto the model that is trapped. So 1 attack each from these would generate into 6 dice. Now, the 2 black dice are the ones from the Elven Blade, so they would get a +1 to wound. The elves are generally strength 3, so they're trying to wound a model that is defense 6, and that would be a 6+ on a dice roll. So here we'll roll the dice. We've got a 6 on here and a 6 on here. Now, because the Elven Blade is a +1 to wound, when it comes to wounding rolls, because of it taking a -1 on the fight roll, it would be wounding him on a 5 as opposed to a natural 6. But that's 2 wounds, which is enough to kill the Uruk-hai model off. So it's not looking good for the Uruk-hai so far. Then you would move on to the next fights. Obviously there aren't any, so it goes back to the priority phase. Priority phase, same basis. This time the elves have priority. You could then move into heroic actions. However, we're not going to go into that. And we're going to continue to play on from here. The Uruk-hai need to be down to 3 models, I believe. Yes, so they need to exceed the break point down to 3 models alone before they would be testing for breaking, which is essentially whether or not they run or not. They continue to fight throughout, and generally it doesn't happen so often with more hardy troops, but it can happen with kind of more like your generic goblins and orcs and hobbits and stuff like that, which aren't superior courage values, to be fair. So the elves are going to move up, because at this moment in time they are going to be stuck in combat with these guys. So I think we've had enough at shooting. We're going to go and get stuck in and move up as so. And that's the same with my captain. And same thing with the bowman. These guys, they like their chances, so they will come in here and they will try. You know what, let's pin him in like so, sacrifice him off. And that's the elf player's movement. Then goes on to the Uruk-hai player's movement. When a model is locked in combat, it essentially means they cannot move out of combat. There's no kind of real way out of that. It's a good way of locking in models that you don't want them to do stuff. So locking in, say, Uglug with 1 model, sometimes sacrificing him to the greater good, can therefore benefit other players, because Uglug could kill, say, 2 models a turn. Sometimes even more if he was to combat off of that with heroics, and again, he could be quite a monster when he wants to be. So the only ones valid to move would be the 2 pikemen. So the pikemen here, we're going to pike support here and pike support here. So in this area, same method as the spear support, the elves would not be able to hit this model or this model with wounding. They can only wound what they're in base-to-base contact with. However, it's the opposite with the pike supports. Both of these models can wound these 2 because of their pushing, spiking, obviously, of the pike itself. Pikes can spear support 2 models. However, they need to be modelled with the same. So you can't have a spear followed by a pike. It's a pike can only support a pike, which in this area of game is really tactical, and it can be beneficial because you can get a free man kind of dice pool, but only 1 man can die. And in this situation where you're fighting 2 versus 3, it works in your favour when it comes down to ratios of dice. So shooting wise, in this situation we've moved the elves full, so they would not be able to shoot. However, if they were to try and shoot, they can only shoot something that is not in combat. So for all purposes, pike supports can be shot if they have a clear line of sight to them. So for instance, this model here would be able to shoot this model here without going through an intervening combat, which would work really well if you were to do that in a kind of a competitive way, because it stops this guy from giving an attack bonus. But you cannot shoot into a combat which has got a friendly model in, because you're good. Essentially, you don't want to kill your own guys, and that's the benefit of kind of what the good player has. The evil player, however, does not really care about life in general, so they will shoot into combats, and it will be 50-50s when it comes down to who they kill, which sometimes is a great shout, because things like killing these guys off and stuff like that in a combat would prevent things from occurring later on in the sequence. So it's helpful to know when it comes down to choosing your army, if you really want to be a scumbag and go down the route of I can kind of do these things and do these things, and that's where the interesting gameplay comes into play, then the evil factions usually have a lot more things they can do in the grand scheme of stopping the opponent with magic casters and shooting into combats and war machines and monsters and hurling and all the rest of it. But good players, they generally don't get to shoot into combat. So we've done the move phase, we've done the shoot phase because there's no shooting, we then move into the combat phase. The elf player now has combat, so they decide which one to go for. I think in this situation it doesn't make much difference, but we're going to go for the 2 elves versus the 2 Uruk-hai here. Because of the 3 versus 2, I'm not going to use the Elven Blade because it reduces my chances of getting that natural 6 and therefore winning on fight value. So I would use my Elven Blade with a single hand. You usually have to tell the opponent about, well, you do have to tell the opponent if you're using like a certain weapon or a certain profile or some sort of special attack, just because it's more clarity, and again, they understand what you're trying to do, and it stops all debates around the game itself. So you have 2 dice for the elves. You then have 3 dice from the Uruk-hai. Now, the Uruk-hai don't have any special benefits bar the fact they can pike support in combat. So it is a natural roll, no modifiers to it. The elf player takes it on a 6, again, because their fight value is higher than the Uruk-hai. So if the Uruk-hai was to get, say, a 6 and it came to a draw combat, the elf player would win on their fight value being higher. And that is just kind of what happens. You then roll to wound. The 2 Gladrim will try and wound this chap at the front. He's slightly less defense than the Uruk-hai Shieldman, so he's defense 5. They would need 5s, so they're strength 3 versus the defense of a 5. They roll double 1, which fails miserably. If they were to have fainted, so another special strike with a sword, they would reduce their fight value by d3, which again is kind of important for this. But they would get to reroll 1 dice with a 1 on the nominated target that fainted. You can't roll all the dice unless they all faint in certain situations, and you can only faint if you are a higher fight value or equal to the opponent. So it is again a risk to benefit ratio when a special striking. So because the elves won, you would essentially make way with the Uruk-hai and back off an inch from the opponent. So just illustrating that they're not trapped. You then move on to the second combat, which is Uglug, who is the captain. He rolls 2 dice, and then you have 1 individual guy here. So I'll roll the Uruk-hai first, and then your spearman. So Uglug gets a 4, and then the Uruk-hai gets a 5. You have a spearman who has 1 dice. He gets a 4. So at the moment, it's not looking good. Again, there are modifiers to re-roll your dice. They're usually banners or area effects of heroes, or might modifiers if your hero needs to use them to bonus. But in this situation, we have none of those in place, so it is a case of, right, straight roll. The 5 would take over the 4, the Uruks win. This elf can move back, so he is not trapped, so there's no modifier to come into wound. You have 2 different strength values here. So you have a strength 4 model, which again is quite strong. Usually most heroes are. And then you have a strength 5 model, which essentially is your captain, your Uglug here. Strength 5 versus defense 5 is a flat roll of a 4+. Uglug kills him, does 1 wound. Model has 1 wound, therefore removed from play. That's the first elf dead. And that's how that plays out. So generally those are the basics. I think in this situation, if the game continues, the elf captain, so if we play, say, 1 more round, the captain versus captain, it might make a little bit more of a difference to what might happen next. But I think in this play, the elves would generally break them because of their higher fight value and their superior in numbers now. But that's in a nutshell how you would play this. If we play to the point where we do courage tests, that will kind of cover all plays of the basics of it anyway. So the priority phase, again, 6 going 6. This is a good aspect to learn. If you draw on this, it goes to the player who did not have priority the previous turn. So the elves had it last, the Uruk-hai would take it next, which is helpful for them. I think in true Uglug fashion, he's going to go and take the head of the captain. Over here, I think what we'd do is we'd charge him here. And again, we'll go into those 2 as before and pike support to reduce the amount of damage inflicted there. For this last one here, I think what we'll do is we'll take a pot shot at that last one just for a little bit of understanding of what you can do. So that's the movement phase. Moving on to the shooting phase, because again, we don't want to move this bowman because he wants a clear shot of his target. This one bowman will shoot at this middle pikeman, so hopefully breaking the chain and saving his mates. He needs to hit on a 3+. He does, because he did not move. He needs to wound him on a 5+, which he doesn't wound. Pings off his armor. and there's no shooting from the Urukai. The combats are now disputed via the first players with priority. So the player with priority will choose to go with the 3 pikemen versus the 2 individual swordsmen. I think in this situation I will feint with one of these guys, which will reduce my fight value by D3, but the opponent will keep his fight 5. So that's a good trick to learn when you come to play a bit more competitively. The Urukai roll a 5 plus highest, and then your fainting elf gets a 2, and the spearman elf gets a 2. The Urukai win. You would reduce the D3 at this point, but again, there's another additional person, and the fight value doesn't matter because you've rolled higher. 3 dice, essentially all wounding on 5s, because it's a defense 5 and a defense 6 model, and you're a strength 4. You would nominate your targets in this, but for general kind of sportsmanship, you'd say, right, okay, it would roll over to the other. They're both the same to wound. I'm looking at 5s to wound, to which they did none, which is classical. And then they essentially back, and that's your combat phase done, and an opportunity missed from the Urukai to get back into this. You have 1-on-1 here. Your dice pool is again generated by your attacks value in your characteristic stats. They both have 1 dice each. Yellow is obviously the elf. They're not going to do special strikes. The Urukai would win on a 5. You'd need a 5 plus to wound. Defense of 5. And it doesn't wound him. And then into your hero fight. Now the heroes are slightly different. Their attack pool is bigger. So a captain model here, they both have 2 dice. They're different fight values. Ugluggers fight 5, so the same as the elf warriors, but the elf captain is a fighter 6. And that again is quite a good fight skill. So in the aspect of a draw, the elf captain would win. And the elf captain takes it on a 5. Again, you would use mind points and stuff, but we're not using that to influence the dice rolls. I'm strength 4 here, as opposed to my strength 3 of my normal warriors. I'd need 5s to wound. Causing a single wound would kill Uglug. And he's missed the opportunity himself. So generally he lives on 1 wound. But in that situation, had he died, that would brought him down quite low, and then you'd go into courage tests. I'll go through courage tests just basically with you now. So for instance, if we'd lost, I don't know, Uglug. So actually, let's lose 1 pikeman. So that would bring you down to below half of your starting value. We'd need to lose 1 more. So say you started with 6 models, you'd have to go down to 2 models, essentially, because 3 would be 50%, and you need to exceed that 50%. Isengard do have army bonuses and stuff, which are more special, but that won't come into play here. When it comes to courage tests, when you start with priority before you move, you need to test for this. So if your models are below 50% of their starting value, you need to test. You start by testing hero models first. And that's particularly because they have a stand fast area in most cases, unless it specifies. So within a 6-inch radius of a normal hero model, things would stay if you passed, which is really really helpful when it comes to the end stages of a game, just to try and make sure you don't end up losing ground and stuff like that in objectives. So Uglug here would have a courage value of 4. Courage value 4. Let's make sure. Yeah. So courage value of 4, you need to get up to 10, and you roll 2 dice to do this. So he smashes it with an 11, he therefore acts as normal, and wherever he ends his move, so for instance he comes and charges over here, everything within 6 would then act normally. If, say, something was out of 6, like this poor pikeman over here, and he's ended his movement and he's still out, he has to do this on his own now to do the same. Now his courage value is less, it's courage value 3. So you'd need a 7+ before modifiers. Again, he passes, there's no problem. You'd act as normal, like so. And that's it in a nutshell. Some heroes have a bigger stand fast, so kind of like your Theodens and your legendary legions, your kings and your kind of special characters, they can go up to 12 inches and sometimes battlefield wide, which is really helpful. And sometimes things that you can do to prevent
stand fasts occurring and stuff. Again, when it comes into really important phases like priority, you can pin captains and heroes down so that other models would then not benefit from their stand fast and have to test individually, therefore swinging the amount of models that you would lose. If a model fails its courage test and when it's broken, it then flees the battlefield and is gone, and then counts as a casualty in most scenarios. So that is something that's really important to understand. It can make the game go so much quicker when it comes down to breaking the opponent, playing tactically, spreading their forces out, and then therefore ultimately winning the game. So hopefully that's of benefit. Again, it's kind of a basic breakdown. I will do some more videos so people understand a bit more about what's available to them, because there's so much depth and so much more things to kind of learn and love as you go along. So hopefully you've enjoyed that. I'll get this video up soon, and if there's any comments or feedback or things that people would like me to clarify and go through, I'm happy to do that for you. Okay, all the best. Bye bye now.